Hello, my name is Jill, and in this video I'm going to cover 4 topics: the cognitive load theory, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, 3 principles for reducing extraneous load, and refutation text. Let's get started. First, for the cognitive load theory. The cognitive load theory explains the human cognitive processes. There are 5 principles of the cognitive load theory. The first is information storage. Massive amounts of information can be held in the long-term memory. The next principle is borrowing and reorganizing. This idea suggests that we learn from other people. Next is randomness as genesis, meaning in an absence of knowledge, guess, then test your guesses. Next principle is narrow limits of change, which means that the working memory is limited to enhance rather than to inhibit learning. Finally, the last principle is environmental organizing and linking, which helps establish the correct response for each situation or when to use in context. Within the architecture of the cognitive theory, there is working memory, which has limitations, long-term memory, which has massive storage space, and schemas, which are structures that organize the knowledge that you have learned. This is the process in which human cognition stores information. The 3 types of mental load are also an important part of the cognitive load theory. The first is intrinsic load, which has to do with the complexity of the learning material and the number of interacting elements. Next is extraneous load, which is due to the way the materials are presented, not the difficulty. Finally, germane load is due to the learning process, also known as affective load. To summarize, the goal of instruction of the cognitive load theory is to present an appropriate amount of intrinsic load, meaning it's not too complicated, while minimizing extraneous cognitive load, meaning the lesson has good instructional design, and finally, to maximize resources available for learning. Now for the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, also referred to as CTML. CTML considers and expands on the cognitive load theory. There are 3 assumptions that drive the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. The first is dual channels. This means we process information through our eyes and our ears. Second is limited processing, which refers directly to the working memory's limited capacity. Third is active processing, which refers to the cognitively effective learner and when they are selecting, organizing, and integrating information. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning is based on 3 types of memory, which are sensory memory, so using our eyes and our ears, working memory, which again is very limited even though it takes up lots of space, and the long-term memory, which is our prior knowledge. Cognitive processing in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is similar to the cognitive load theory. CTML has extraneous processing, extraneous cognitive load in which cognitive load theory, which is the way the information is presented. CTML, essential processing, which is based on how the information the learner already knows, which is similar to intrinsic load. Finally, CTML has generative processing, which is the information left over after processing, like germane cognitive load. Lastly, I will talk about the goals of instruction according to CTML. They are to reduce extraneous cognitive load or get rid of the extra stuff, to manage intrinsic cognitive load appropriately, meaning to make sure learning context is the same level as the learner, and finally to facilitate generative processing techniques or to use effective techniques such as self-questioning. As you can see, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is basically an expansion of the cognitive load theory. Next, I'm going to talk about 3 of the 5 instructional design principles. These principles will help the learner focus on essential information and avoid focusing on extraneous information, which causes cognitive overload. After the brief discussion of these three principles, there'll be a short 3-slide presentation on anxiety in the classroom. And then in the presentation, I will demonstrate these three principles. The first principle is the redundancy principle. To maximize learning, aim to reduce redundancy. Redundancy occurs when the same information comes in through due modalities, such as through the eyes and through the ears, or when a lesson is verbally and textually given at the same time. The information should either be read aloud or the text should be written on a screen so the students can read it themselves, but not both. Redundant information can distract the learner from important information, as they try to read the text on the screen as it is read aloud also. Again, to reduce cognitive load, either write the text or read the text for the students to hear or to see. The first slide is a good example of redundancy. The second slide is a bad one because the text is on the screen as well as it being read aloud at the same time. The second principle that I will discuss in this video is the signaling principle. The signaling principle helps the learner identify important information. A signal points out important information which allows the learner to quickly locate and focus on this information. This principle can lower cognitive load by reducing the search for information. Signaling also helps with the selecting phase in the processing process, which is when we select information that is important. Signaling can also help us organize and integrate information as well. Not only can signaling be created through arrows, underlining, and bold text like shown here, it can also be created through the tone of voice as well. The third and final principle that I'm going to talk about in this video is the spatial contiguity principle. This principle deals with the location of labeling, which reduces the visual search for information. Labeling should be on the same slide and close to the information, not far away. Relevant information should be close together. Take a look at these two pictures. The second one definitely has less visual search than the first one. So the second picture best represents the spatial contiguity principle. All of these principles are reinforced by the cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. In the cognitive load theory, the amount of information we can process from our working memory into our long-term memory is our cognitive load. Effective instructional design through the use of these principles helps students recognize important information, ignore extraneous information, which allows them to use their cognitive capacity with their working memory to process important information to long-term memory. When it comes to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning these principles all aid in effective selecting of words and pictures, and then organizing them into auditory and pictorial modes that are then integrated and stored in long-term memory. Now I will demonstrate these principles in the short presentation on anxiety. The first slide demonstrates the redundancy principle because I have provided the learner with a picture and will say something like, anxiety is prevalent in today's classrooms. 25% of students experience mild to moderate anxiety, and nearly 6% experience severe anxiety. This provides dual modalities of visual as well as audio, but does not repeat the text and spoken words. This second slide demonstrates signaling principle because the bolded and underlined words are the important information that I want the learner to take in. So it helps them to quickly locate and focus on this information. So in this case, physical, behavior, and psychological are the important words I want the learner to take in. This last slide demonstrates the spatial contiguity principle. This slide demonstrates this because the labels are directly with the picture. which reduces the visual search for the learner. In other words, the relevant information is close together. This helps the learner by identifying these coping skills either by the picture or the labels. Lastly, for this video, let's talk about refutation text. Refutation text is a textual structure that organizes information effectively, which challenges the learner's misconceptions. Refutation text has three components. The first is the assumed fact or misconception. Next is the refutation, or saying it isn't true. And finally, the third component is the statement of the facts, or the explanation. There are several misconceptions in the realm of school counseling. Here is an example of refutation text relating to the field of school counseling. There's a common misconception that since I work in a decently wealthy school district with affluent and well-educated families, there are fewer students with mental health issues. This statement is completely inaccurate. The fact is that America's newly identified as risk group is preteens and teens from affluent, well-educated families. In spite of their economic and social advantages, they experience among the highest rates of depression, substance abuse, anxiety disorders, social somatic complaints, as well as unhappiness of any other group of children in this country. That is all for this video. We have discussed many topics, but I hope you have learned and found out it to be helpful. Thank you for watching.